Well, welcome everyone to this evening's Sphere webinar. My name is John Snoad. I'm a senior manager at Sphere Education Initiatives. And this evening we're presenting a webinar titled Building Tolerance and Peaceful Coexistence with Civil Discourse. For those of you that are new to Sphere or have just recently become aware of our organization, Sphere is a nonpartisan organization that provides educators with viewpoint diverse resources, programming, online publications, webinars such as this, in-person professional development, among other things, on various topics for use in the classroom, centered on current challenges and public policy issues, as well as relevant content from your curriculum and standards. I'm really excited about this event tonight. It's been a long time in the works, and we're so blessed to have so many great participants tonight. Welcome to everyone. I want to just note that this is a really, really important topic, and it was generated basically from educators in the network, you out there who've asked us, how do we have conversations around this challenging and timely issue? So we recognize that the subject of the discussion has been widely polarizing and challenging both domestically and internationally. In some cases, it has surfaced in your classrooms in sometimes unproductive or uncomfortable ways in and around the country. In our work with educators all over the United States, we've had these questions come up. How do we help our students understand complex contemporary religious differences and conflicts? And is living in peace and harmony attainable? Uh, it's in this light that we chose to bring this important conversation to bear. We're really grateful once again to have all of you join us, but we also want to remind everyone about the expected decorum tonight. While we invite your questions during the discussion, they should remain respectful and be clearly articulating a question. Inappropriate remarks or questions will lead to individuals being removed from the event and future ones. The focus of our discussion is learning the historical context of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship and how we can promote civil discussion and ultimately peace. Well, so without further ado, I want to introduce our guest this evening. I'll start with Dr. Ari Gordon. Ari is the Director of Muslim-Jewish Relations for the American Jewish Center, where he builds partnerships between Jews and Muslims, enabling them to work together on issues of common concern and fostering productive engagement on issues of difference. His work is based on the premise that healthy Muslim and Jewish relations help both communities and strengthens the democratic fabric of our world. Ari lectures regularly in academic, Jewish, and multi-faith settings on Judaism, the history of interreligious relations, and religion in the world today. Ari completed a PhD in Islamic studies, where his research focused on sacred geography and interreligious relations in Islam's formative period. Gordon grew up in Philadelphia and is fluent in Arabic and Hebrew. I'm sure you're really excited if you're an Eagles fan. Next, I want to introduce Mustafa Akyol, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Mustafa focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. He is the author of acclaimed books such as Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World, and Why, and a book that many of you in our Sphere network are quite familiar with, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty. He was a longtime contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and teaches classes at Boston College and the Foreign Service Institute. In July of 2021, the Prospect magazine of the United Kingdom listed him among the world's top 50 thinkers. So really, really excited to have you both here, and invite you first, before we get started with focusing on the past intertwined history. Most of all, I'll start with you. Anything you want to start with this evening to talk about the situation?
Thanks so much, John. And thanks to everyone who joined us from all across the US, and good evening to you all. We are having this conversation, of course, in the shadow of this horrific conflict that we've seen in the Middle East in the past 16 months. It has been heartbreaking to see, horrific violence committed against civilians in October 7th, first in Israel, then the catastrophic war in Gaza, hurting such a big causing such a big calamity, on the Palestinian people there, with many civilians. And this conflict has made, as we probably many of us have observed, a lot of people think that, this is a conflict between two peoples that have deep roots. It's an irreconcilable conflict. Here you have two religions, over Aqsa, or all the sacred sites. And I challenge that perception, and I think it doesn't help us find a way towards peace. I believe this is not a religious war between Islam and Judaism. I believe it's a political war between two peoples over land, and whose land is this one? Both of those people certainly have a connection to that land. None of that is, unimportant. Both of them are legitimate. And ultimately, the question is, how do we make them share the land? I mean, we'll probably come to that towards the second, third questions. But I look at this from a religious angle. My work is about Islam and modernity, and the ideas of freedom and tolerance and pluralism within Islam. And in my recent book, The Islamic Moses, I it says how the Prophet inspired Jews and Muslims flourish together. Because actually, until the modern era, Muslims and Jews didn't see each other most of the time through a lens of conflict. Rather, there is both a lot of religious links that make the two religions very similar to each other, and there is a lived history, a shared history between the Muslim and Jewish peoples. Moses, which is the reason why I made him a title of my book, is that when you read the Quran, you see that he's the most dominant figure in the Islamic scripture by far more than anybody else, because Prophet Muhammad and the first Muslims saw Moses and the Israelites as their role model, and their liberation from oppression was their inspiring story. And that initiated what others have called, and I also call, the Judeo-Islamic tradition. Many people in the United States are familiar with the term Judeo-Christian, which is a valid way of connecting these two religions. But I think there's something missing in there that's Judeo-Islamic. And both Ari and I, we had this conversation at Cato a few months ago too. But I think we believe in bringing these religious perspectives of commonalities, shared histories, and coexistence into the scene, because there are also bad religious actors into the scene, right? Which demonize the other side. But I think there is enough in the values of our religious traditions, in the histories of our peoples, to keep fostering ideas of peace, even when it seems very improbable, at least today. But sometimes peace becomes possible when people get exhausted by the terrible realities of war. And I would only hope that we may be heading towards such a direction in Israel and Palestine.
Thank you, Mustafa. Ari, what are your thoughts on all of that, and particularly how things are today? We're going to dive in the past here in a moment.
Yeah, I'm I'm grateful, Mustafa, that we get to have this conversation with a group of educators, because if we're going to be doing this differently and writing a different future, it's going to really have to start in the classroom. And as you said, there have been so many parts of society in America, which is some ways off from where the fighting is taking place, that have felt the pressure of this, that who have had their hearts broken, um, either because they're tied to or have seen the images or heard the stories of the massacre on October 7th and the ongoing crisis of hostages, or because they've found themselves drawn to just horrific images and stories that they've heard coming out of Gaza and other parts of the Middle East as a result of the war, or their hearts are breaking twice because they're with all peoples affected or multiple times. Um, so I think my overwhelming feeling here is gratitude that we get to have this conversation, that such a great group of people from across the country are invested in at least getting stimulated to think about viewpoint diversity on this. How do we do this better? What are the tools that we can either bring into our classrooms, or at the very least carry with us when we engage in other conversations? When in the last year and more, when I've met new people and introduce myself, and I say, oh, what do you do? Well, I'm a father, I'm a friend, all of that. But what do I do professionally? I'm the director of Muslim Jewish relations at American Jewish Committee. And when they hear Muslim Jewish relations, I kind of get that face like someone in your family just passed away. They go, "Ooh, how you doing?" Right? Like there's this understanding that trying to work on this bridge in the world where this war is raging has become more challenging, and it's incredibly challenging, and tensions are high for all the reasons Mustafa said. But I have to agree with you, Mustafa, that it's not an essential, eternal, inherent religious war, so that people who carry the identity Jewish and people who carry the identity Muslim, or people who carry the identity Israeli or identify as Palestinian must necessarily be in conflict. It is right now that knot feels very tight, like it will never be untied. But I think some of our job and some of our opportunity in the near and medium term is to loosen it. And we can. And some of what we're trying to do here today is to help people loosen the knot.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you both for that. And I think what I'd like to lead in with now is taking a look at exploring that shared history, because I think that is where we can start to maybe unravel that knot a little bit. Both faiths have really rich traditions of high scholarship. They share geographic origins, long periods of peaceful coexistence. I wonder if each of you could reflect on how these shared histories have shaped the cultures of your respective faiths. And in that vein, always thinking about the educators who are present here is think about and maybe what advice might you give them, and how the relationships between these communities evolved, particularly during the long stretches of coexistence, and what lessons that we today can draw from that. Ari, why don't we start with you on this one?
I was going to say Mustafa just wrote a wonderful book on this subject. So
okay.
I'm glad to be able to say just a little bit, because whatever I miss, he'll fill in. Yeah, looking at the history of the relationship between Muslims and Jews is a really helpful exercise for us to be thinking about the present. It's true that Islam and its message emerged into a world with biblical and Judaic system of symbols and narratives, and Christian and others, by the way, as well. But that the whirlpool of ideas that was out there when Islam emerged into the world was one that had shared systems of symbols, shared narratives, many similar beliefs. Of course, there were always points of conflict and differentiation and narratives of conflict, but there's a lot of opportunity there for us to talk about intertwined spiritualities, is what I would call it. And then as time went on, and Islam and Islamic communities spread and reached sort of an incredible era of the development of knowledge and sciences, Jews and Jewish tradition was deeply shaped by all of that knowledge that was being cultivated, whether it was philosophical, literary, scientific, theological. I mean, there was all this engagement that we could talk about, and mutual learning, and even symbiosis, we might say, as some scholars call it. And even business partnership and neighbors and cultural exchange, all of these things that we could talk to about cooperation. If I take a step back and put on a historian's cap, and I'm sure we have some history teachers here out there, I think it's also important to recognize that we can't only tell one kind of story. To tell only the story as though it was a perpetual golden age without any conflict and issues between communities, it's not accurate, but it's also not helpful. It's not accurate because there were points of conflict. The Jews were a minority. There were episodes in the history where some rulers and periods mistreated them in all kinds of ways. And we have to tell those, even if they were episodic and not the norm. And part of why it's not helpful, though, to tell only one or the other is because people can run the risk of imposing onto the present a story of the past, or using the past, manipulating the story of the past for an agenda in the present. What I mean by that is there are those out there, some in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community, who would only want to tell a story of conflict. The Jews were always an oppressed and belittled minority and beleaguered minority in Islamic lands. And they would say that is why this conflict will exist forever. It is inherent in the religion and the culture. And this is wrong and not helpful. There are those who, when they only tell the story of Golden Age, want to imagine that the only problem is the existence of the modern state of Israel or one type of nationalism. And that if only that went away, all the problems would go away because everything was perfect before then. And that's not accurate, and it's not helpful either. So sometimes I think what we do and here's the lesson I think for students, being able to train our students in critical thinking, to be able to say you can't impose a simple narrative onto thousand plus years and incredibly broad and diverse geographic contexts. You actually have to look at each context on its own. That's what we do as historians. And also that our past is not a determinant of our present and future. We get to write our future. And so whether I think there's only a negative past or not, or I feel bogged down by that, the future can look different and we can take agency in shaping it.
Love the message there. And it shouldn't be lost on anyone that you're talking about providing a diversity of viewpoints, which is at the fundamental core of what we do at Sphere. So, and you were not prompted to say that, so that was perfect for. I think that really brings home the message to all of us that are in this space, how important it is that we tell the whole story and that we let students discover that. Mustafa, you and I have had more than one conversation after you graciously gave me a copy of your book to read, which I subsequently marked up and highlighted all through it, and which really led to this conversation. So take us back, and as you really eloquently pointed out the relationship between the faiths. So love to hear your perspective on this.
Every time I listen to Ari, I can't help but agree. So, we should find something to disagree and fight over too. But, my book covers a lot. I'll just maybe tell you one thing. I'm living in Washington, D.C. in the past 7 years, but my hometown is Istanbul, Turkey. I'm from there. And if you go to Turkey, there's a small Jewish museum that I would recommend visiting. It tells the story of Sephardic Jews who've been living in Istanbul for over 5 centuries. Now, Sephardic means from Spain, and they are Sephardic Jews because they came from Spain to the Ottoman Empire. Now, when did that happen? That happened at the time of Christopher Columbus, when neither Spain nor Christendom at the time was not the liberal, tolerant, pluralist, continent that we see today. It was a time when the Christian monarchs imposed their what they call Alhambra decree to Jews, which saying that you either have to convert to Christianity or you will be expelled. And most of them, chose to leave Spain, and it was a horrific, expulsion with a lot of deaths on the road and violence and most of they went to different ways, but many of those went to Islamic lands and especially the Ottoman Empire. And the luckiest of them were those who went to the Ottoman Empire, as one Jewish scholar said, because at the time, Islamic world was much more hospitable to the Jewish people. This was the time when Europe was really infested with anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism, and then there would be a racial anti-Semitism, which would even be worse, during the time of Nazis. And there are many episodes like that, which shows that Jews preferred living with Muslims to Christians at the time, because the Christians were not the tolerant, pluralistic, loving Christians many people would imagine today, because of Christianity has had a great transformation by renouncing violence and coercion in the name of religion. Now, I see that transformation in Western Christianity as a wonderful thing that has happened. And it was not an easy thing, that it came with ideas of freedom and tolerance and liberalism and a lot of theological changes within. And also many Christians revisited their understanding of Jews and Judaism. There has been a lot of soul searching and like, how did we do these things? Why did we see the Jewish people as an enemy? And there's been much evolution of thought regarding that in Christianity as well. Now, this shows civilizations can have their better or worse times. Now, what happened is that, unfortunately, in the Muslim Middle East, we have our not so good times in the past 100 years. And that's why the relationship has changed. I mean, you've seen people not migrating to Muslim land. You don't see Jewish communities migrating to Muslim lands. What you see is them migrating from Muslim lands. That happened in the 1950s from much of the Arab world. And now the point here is this shows, I mean, this whole very different episodes where you see Muslims saving, like the Ottoman Empire saving Jews from persecution, shows that, as Ari said, this is not an eternal enmity that is burning there. Yes, the two religions obviously have differences. There are stereotypes against the other in every religion. It happens. But if you look at theologically and historically, you can say Islam and Judaism have coexisted and lived peacefully most of the time in the past 1400 years. Now, it was not egalitarian. Muslims were ruling superior. So it's not an ideal, maybe liberal heritage. By the way, the Ottoman Empire also even brought equal citizenship in the 19th century, and I think that's important as well. Now, this is important to note, and I think there are these episodes, there are these stories we can tell each other. I mean, I recently spoke to a group in Chicago, and I told them how in the Chicago World Fair of 1893, the Ottoman Mosque hosted a Yom Kippur service, and it was positively reported by American Jewish journalist Isidore Levy, and he wrote about this in 1903, and he said, this shows how the Muslims are tolerant. They're so tolerant to host other people in their mosques. This is a lesson that the Western people should learn. I mean, this is 20 years ago. The world was different. Now, I agree with Ari that the argument that this all got disrupted just because Israel got founded, therefore after Israel, if there will be a future like that, things will be good. That's not true. I think what really caused the particular conflict in the Middle East, I call it a nationalism problem. And nationalism is on both sides. Nationalism has emerged in all the peoples of the region, and the idea of a nation state. And nationalist conflicts are terrible. I've seen it all across the post-Ottoman territories, in the Balkans, between Turks and Armenians, horrific expulsion of Armenians from Turkey in 1915. So you can either go until the end when, God forbid, one side is really decimated, or you can have a live and live let solution. You can make some agreements. We've seen that. We've seen that in the Balkans after the Yugoslav Civil War. So I think that's a goal that we should politically, intellectually, culturally, and religiously should work for. And I believe these shared histories and religious commonalities are important to bring to the table as sources of inspiration.
Thank you. You actually, there's a perfect lead in right to the next segment here. Because despite that shared history that has bound them, in many cases, there's no denying that deep divides have emerged over the course of the past century or so. So you actually mentioned a couple of the isms, if you will. So I was actually wondering, the role, maybe dive a little deeper into the role that imperialism, colonialism, and of course nationalism have played in that, and the establishment of these modern states, particularly Israel, and how these have influenced these dynamics, if you will. All right, go ahead.
Yeah. When we start to talk about the last 100 years, we're treading from history into journalism, and that means there's multiple interpretations and perspectives. because we're all kind of living some of the impacts of the events of the last 100 years or so. I think that I don't disagree with you, Mustafa, that nationalism and nationalisms hold some challenges to coexistence, and in some sense, uh, a tolerant imperial approach was able to encompass more diversity. I think I would push back a little gently by way of answering your question, John, that for Jews, in some of the perspective of Jews over the 1500 2000 years of last years of history, the experience of always being a minority did mean that there were times of flourishing, but it was always somewhat subject to the goodwill of ruling powers, which is not to say that a religion or a particular culture imposes one kind of rule or other. But because of all these episodes, and if you grow up in a Jewish community learning Jewish history, you learn the good stories, but you also can recite some of those episodes. And so the idea that as nationalisms were developing, that Jews wanted to have a collective expression of sovereignty, and that sovereignty tied to a historic homeland is not surprising. However, it's true, right? The land was not empty. It's not as some grew up saying, a land without a people for a people without a land. Um, People were living there, Arabs Palestinians, and these conflicting nationalisms and the idea that these peoples had to have unique expressions did lead to some tensions. I think it's true that it did not start in 1948. Some of those European forms of anti-Semitism, conspiracy theory, in that forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the 19th and early 20th century, made their way into other languages and started to inform in some parts of the Muslim world. Same thing with blood libels, like the Damascus incident in the 1800s, right? So there were things that were happening. Propaganda of World War II, and the Nazis made its way in. These things didn't have to do with the establishment of the state of Israel, but maybe they could be seen as challenges of the 20th or the modern period, where the world was working out what it was going to do with groups that didn't fit this nationalism or that sense of self. So I think those are some of the eras there. Mustafa, I'm sure we'll talk more about colonialism and the imposition of European colonialism and what role that played, and how Jews may have gotten caught up in the identity of ruling European colonial powers. But one thing I do want to end with, because I know we're trying to unearth some of the guts of the challenging discussions, and we should be able to name everything. But if we want to point to some of the ways that these stories get unraveled or retold, we do have all these stories from the current era, whether it's efforts of coexistence and cooperation that are taking place between Israelis and Palestinians, some of our own efforts here in the US for Muslims and Jews to overcome experiences of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together, jointly, and within our own communities. And even if I talk about Nazism and World War II and the ways that it may have touched some parts of the Muslim world, there's good stories to tell, in that we're unearthing all these stories of Arab and Muslim righteous, what we call righteous among the nations, people who saved Jews during that war, including the King of Morocco, who stood up to Vichy French rule to say, these are my citizens. And even as recently as 2020, you can look it up. It's a great story to bring into the classroom. American Jewish Committee partnering with a major Muslim world body, the Muslim World League based in Saudi Arabia, to take a joint trip of Jews and Muslims, religious leaders from around the world to Auschwitz to visit the death camp in Poland to understand what dehumanization of any people, um, the threat that it poses to our world, including the specific history of the dehumanization of Jews and others in that war. So I think each of the episodes of the mid 20th century that we talk about, it was really formative for what became much more heightened tensions than were really there ever before.
Thank you. Mustafa.
I mean, colonialism definitely had a huge impact on the Middle East very negatively. And I just, though, differ with a common narrative in the US, which tries to explain the Arab-Israeli conflict mostly through the lens of colonialism. I mean, Israel is defined as a colonial power, and ultimately, therefore, we want to decolonize it. That's the narrative. Now, I don't agree with that. First of all, I think it's not factually true. Second, it's going to make things very difficult and very dangerous, right? It leads to the false perception that the Israeli people don't see their country as their homeland, historic homeland, but just a colony that they took, and they will go back if you give them enough trouble. Well, that's a road to hell, I think. So that's very dangerous. What colonialism did is, it's besides own all the terrible things the colonial powers did. They just left a memory in the Middle East through which everything is explained. And I think that's an additional problem, because I think things are sometimes more complicated. Now, that's why I insist seeing this as a national conflict between the Palestinian and Israeli people, and of course, people who are emotionally, religiously tied to them. So it just reverberates around the world in different communities. Now, one thing, when there is a national conflict, even a civilizational conflict, certain dynamics work on both sides. One is people only see their own pain. They don't want to see the pain of the other side. They want to trivialize it. They want to deny it. Second, people perceive the other side often by looking at the most disturbing elements on the other side. Their extremists become who they really are. So the most horrific acts of Hamas or other groups on the Palestinian side becomes them. They're all like that. No one is uninvolved. It's a whole population. And some of the war criminals, or, like really uh, extreme Zionists who really would love to kill people and expel them, they become the whole definition of what Zionism is, or the whole current Israeli society is. I think we should resist those tendencies, because these things make the conflict unresolvable. Whereas what's happening is that in both sides, you have people who would just want to live in what is their homeland, and they could be okay with a peace deal. They could be okay with a coexistence. And I think, especially sometimes, people who are not suffering become the most vocally radical, because it doesn't hurt them. I mean, I think the clear case here is Iran. I mean, Iran has been pushing Palestinian groups for a world without Zion. Iran doesn't suffer from this. It's thousands of miles away. But I think you should look at the people who are suffering. And I think same people who are pushing Israel for an even more extreme position regarding the Palestinians. So I have a slogan, I coined in the past 16 months. People keep saying a river, from the river to the sea. There are actors which say river to the sea on both sides. They say we want to get everything from the river to the sea. And my slogan is, let's look at it like this: from the river to the sea, every child should be safe and both people should be free. And how do we achieve that? Requires goodwill, diplomacy, a lot of efforts, but also even understanding the both communities, and trying to make them understand each other a little bit. When you're hurting, it's very hard. But still, I admire all the people in Israel in the past 16 months who pointed to the suffering of the Gazans and trying to open up their society to look into that really honestly. And is this the right thing? Is this the right way to conduct a war? And same thing for the Palestinians who've been trying to empathize with the victims of terrorism and other, acts of violence in the past 60 months and over the years and decades.
Mustafa, what something you said really reminds me. It reminds me a little bit of my age when you talked about um, measuring another community by its extremists or only viewing it in light of its worst actors. Um, I forgot or forget that most of the students in, I guess here, John, where grade 5 to 12, all those students were not alive when 9/11 happened. They were not alive during the what's called the Second Intifada in Israel in the early 2000s. And I think those dual events were so formative for so many people who are watchers of the Middle East. I mean, in America, uh, I think the war on terror, other parts of it were there, and of course the extreme vulnerability and the loss and everything that happened. But of course, also a rhetoric that did see a divide of civilizations. That it was America versus Islam or the West versus Islam, the clash of civilizations model. And I know that for me, first, I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community without much exposure to lots of other people and diverse institutions like so many of our students do today. And I didn't know anyone who was Muslim, and so my view of the other group was really just through what came through the headlines or what adults were talking about. And I think that colored the view of so many people towards anti-Muslim bigotry, also sometimes called Islamophobia, that somehow the identity Muslim or Arab somehow meant you're more predisposed to violence, terror, oppression of women, all of those things. And I think there were so many people who wanted to talk to the good Muslims, the moderate Muslims, the people who were willing to be rejectionist of so much of what was central to Islamic identity. And of course, everyone has the right to define their own religious sense of the world on their own terms. But if you're writing off the majority of people, I think we need to pause and look. And I think we see that sometimes today with Jews as well, that sure, there are Jewish actors and supporters of Israel who are Jewish, who are trying to either shut down discussion that's critical of that government and the war, that are imposing a certain view. But I see out there so many people who won't sit down with a Jewish interlocutor because of the bad actions of either another state or another actor that's out there. And it's so unfortunate that wars and violence, and especially that as they dominate our headlines, that is so often the first touch point students and people have with the other culture and the other faith. And I think one thing that we have as an opportunity, and I think that what we're trying to do here also, Mustafa, with you and I, is that doesn't need to be the only touch point. It doesn't need to be the lens through which you view the entirety of another people.
You've both actually done incredibly well at humanizing this discussion, and that's a key point, right? I was going to go to the last question, but I actually think the questions I'm seeing in the chat will actually get us there because you've already kind of been talking about a way forward, and how we can do this and how do we help students come to grips with this, and taking this diverse humanistic approach is a winning formula. So I'm going to go ahead and start gathering some of the questions here. So I'll start with one of our Sphere Fellows, Matt Alander, asks, are there any lessons from the Camp David Accords or similar efforts that are, I was alive then, by the way, that are applicable to the current tensions in the Middle East?
Who are you asking this to?
It wasn't directed to anyone in particular, but either of you like to take a stab at that one?
I mean, I can say a few things, and Ari can, of course, definitely say wiser things than me, as always. I mean, I think Camp David Accords was a success, and it has shown that the formula land for peace, right? I mean, it began with that with that peace deal, and a lot of people thought that Egypt was the most, determined, rival threat or enemy to Israel. But Egypt, by getting Sinai back, made a peace deal with Israel, which has been going on since then. Now, if there was no land given back, if their land was still occupied, they would not probably do that. And if some like if far right people in Israel who wanted to keep Sinai as a part of a greater Israel were dominant, that would not be possible, right? So therefore, I think, of course, the Palestinian question is more difficult because Palestinians and Israelis claim the exact same country. But there are international, standards, laws, 67 borders with land swaps. There's this basic idea of a two-state solution. That still, I think, is the only formula, a confederal or two independent states. Palestinians should have something of their own so they can call it this is home so that they can be at peace with Israel. And if Egypt was able to do it with Camp David, why not? Why not? It can be possible. And sometimes, these are hard. I mean, there has been so many times the peace deal between the IRA and the British government collapsed, but ultimately at some point it started to work. So I think, yeah, it was, I think, a good event showing that peace is possible. And the getaway is that both sides should feel that they're getting something out of it. It's not just imposed on one side.
Yeah. I think that's right. And especially for some of our young people, they don't know that there's been this not long, but decades long history of peace building, whether it's Camp David or Oslo or the peace treaty with Jordan or the Abraham Accords. And each of these has flaws, and we could criticize each one. And of course, none of them led to the sovereignty, justice, security, dignity for both peoples, Israelis and Palestinians. That's been elusive. But the idea that peace building a has some momentum or has a history is one thing that's really important. I think the other thing that we want to be able to remind people is that you I probably on both sides of this conflict, you or supporters on both sides, you can't go around the other party. That's not going to be effective. That there are plenty of Israelis and supporters of Israel that, for this political reality or that political leader, think, well, we'll just go around and not have to look at this challenge or conflict. And I think that has happened in the last decades. There hasn't been the kind of seriousness towards peace building efforts that have been needed. And there are certainly those who are very rightfully concerned about the rights of Palestinians and advocates for it, who are making it as though you can go around Israel and the Israelis. But the story of peace building efforts past tells you that peace happens in the room at the table with all parties there. I remember one negotiator from previous Israeli Palestinian negotiations was fond of saying that when you're doing a negotiation, you have to be able to write the victory speech for the people on the other side of the table. That they have to be able to go back to their people and say, yeah, we made concessions, but here's how we got what we needed, and we won. And they need to be able to go back and say, sure, maybe this wasn't exactly what you thought it would look like, but this is a really positive thing. And I think not enough people are going in thinking, how do we help write the success speech for everyone in that conflict?
Move on to another question. This one's ties in well with what you both were just saying as you talk about the reconciliation and moving forward. What role would you like to see the U.S. play in shaping policy in the region at this time? We're getting a lot of messages on what the current administration would like to do versus the previous administration. The teacher, Kim Briles, asked, do you envision a two-state solution as a reality for long-term peace? Um, should the U.S. be involved? Would you want them involved? Why or why not? This is a multi-level question. And if not the U.S., then who could help work work this piece out? And it doesn't have a direct to either one of you, so who would like to start? Mustafa, why don't you go first?
I mean, I think the Camp David gives again a blueprint. I mean, the US was involved because it was kind of in dialogue with both sides and brought the two sides together. Now, I'm not in favor of US trying to solve every problem in the world, especially with military means. That has been quite counterproductive in many cases. But as a diplomatic power, yes, definitely. And I think that will be possible, more possible, if the US is perceived as an honest broker by both sides, which is not the fact on the ground today. And I think that, in other words, US should not be seen as just solely supporting Israel, no matter what any Israeli government does, but upholding international law and universal standards of human rights and ethics of war. And of course, the U.S.-Israeli relationship is deep and historical, and of course it will continue, but it can still continue in a way that Palestinians can also have some trust in the U.S. as a problem solver. We're not there. And I think for U.S. to be a helpful actor, therefore, that there has to be a change towards that direction in the U.S. policy, as some Jewish organizations are also saying for a while, for quite a while, rightly so, I think. Like J Street, I have in mind, for example. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I do think that in the medium and medium long term, the two states for two peoples is the best path, even if inelegant and maybe right now seemingly elusive. But that's the way to give two peoples whose identities and peoplehoods map onto the same land and who want to be able to express that in unique ways while making space for the rights of all peoples, again, with, as you said, with the universal standards of rights. And I think the U.S. does have a major role to play. And sure, it needs to ensure that there's trust with all parties there. And I think in the broadening circle of discussion among Arab countries in the Middle East and other Muslim countries, and including Europe, there are opportunities for the table to get even wider. I think the US is an essential partner, but we have an opportunity for a conversation that can help build trust with Palestinians and Israelis alike that includes a much wider group of people. And at American Jewish Committee, we just launched or announced and are about to launch an initiative called the Center for the New Middle East. And yes, even in the midst, or especially in the midst of a horrific war, we want to talk about a vision for the region where all peoples have a place, and actually there's flourishing for all because there's an integrated region where there's no people without its right to self-determination recognized. There's no people that is necessarily, that has to constantly be worried about its security. And that peace path is the way to do it. And the US and other partners have a major role to play.
I had originally wanted to ask you a version of this question, but it also came up in the chat. So, and we talked a little bit about it when we first met and prepped for the event. So, realizing the war continues, is going to continue. We're going to feel the scars of this, and it certainly has impacted conversations. It certainly has led to activism here in the United States. We have it with the ceasefire now, pending hostage releases. How can Jewish and Islamic perspectives on, say, justice and compassion forge a path forward? Uh, one of the teachers, Kelly Young Raymore, asked that very question. What are the effective strategies to help students, in your mind, humanize this? I think you've given some great context to that. My question was, what are the steps necessary for these very important communities to begin healing and build trust?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Mustafa, maybe we should just pause even for a minute with the silence on that question. I mean, I don't know that we'll really do it. Our time is limited, but it's worthy because it's a question about being constructive at a moment of so much destruction and suspicion, and mistrust. And there are many people who believe that there's nothing of value in the other culture, in the other tradition that can help us in this moment. And so it really is steamrolling and going around the other. But I think for people who have relationships or who have exposure, they know that that's not true, both because they know people in the other community who feel differently, and maybe have a more sophisticated view of religion in general, which is that it's shaped by its interpreters, it's shaped by its practitioners, which means it's not static. So are there are there terrible teachings in Judaism that one can marshal to promote an agenda of ethnic cleansing and supremacy? Sure, we see some people doing that. Is that the entirety of Judaism? Of course not. The tremendous well of traditions about mercy and compassion for those, even outside your own extended Jewish family of people, are there. And we need to channel and elevate those. And I see those being being used both to bring compassion for one's own, but also for others. There's not a shortage of Jews expressing empathy about Palestinians, or Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims expressing empathy about Israelis. We just, those aren't the stories or voices that the algorithm feeds each one on the other side very often. And I think that brings me to another thing that I think is embedded and maybe a real strength in both Islamic and Jewish tradition, which is a culture of debate, internal debate, whether it's the legal discussions of halakha, Jewish law, or fiqh, Sharia, Islamic law, the idea that you have multiple schools of thought, multiple opinions, ikhtilaf or machloket, those words for Arabic and Hebrew for debate or discussion, through which the idea is that we all get more knowledge when multiple opinions are on the table. It's something that's there in both traditions and is deeply felt, and something that maybe we need to cultivate a little more. And for those of us in our communities, we should be at the forefront of cultivating civil discourse across diverse viewpoints, at a time when American public life in general needs this so much more. I mean, it's why programs like Sphere are just so important. And it's really interesting. I think they fit really neatly in the way that Islamic and Jewish intellectual culture has really been cultivated for a millennium and a half and more.
Mustafa, do you have any thoughts or suggestions out there? The same idea. What's the path forward? Building off of what Ari said and your own thoughts on that.
I mean, I agree with Ari's points. I'm also glad that he pointed out to some extremist strains in Judaism or in Israel today. There's certainly in Islam and in the Muslim world too. And I think we're both seeing the problems, but we would both object to those problems being taken as the definition of our religion and our community and our tradition. So one can weaponize both the Quran and Hadith, the two basic sources of Islam, or the Hebrew Bible, to really take quotes, and go attack those people, the enemy, and get rid of them. And those passages are there, but also, and they've been oft quoted recently in a very disturbing way. However, there are beautiful passages too. And I quoted two of them at the very end of my book. There's an epilogue about this conflict. And one is from the Bible, probably the most beautiful passage of the Bible. I mean, at least from a political point of view. It's in Exodus 22:20, which says, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." So the Israelites are told that, to show empathy, people who are suffering because you yourself suffered, right? Now, that's a wonderful, I think, moral teaching. I hope that will reverberate around Israel more and more, and, and be more influential, that understanding. Now, in the Quran, there's another one that I quoted. It says, "Do not let the hatred of a people lead you to injustice. Be just, that is closer to righteousness." And those particular people that Muslims hated of some sort were the pagans of Mecca, which had persecuted them terribly. But it still says, do not your anger, your hatred to lead you to injustice, and be just. So that is also lost in some narratives on the Palestinian or the, let's say, the broader Islamic side. Palestinians, of course, by the way, include Palestinian Christians. We should not forget them too. So I think really we could either cultivate the better values of our traditions and scriptures, or we could take certain things and turn them into weapons. A lot of people are doing that. And I was horrified to see that on my timeline on Twitter or something in the past 16 months. But we cannot let those narratives to dominate our own religions, civilizations, communities. We should rather cultivate the noble values, which are there. If we focus on them more, the world may be a better place. Yeah.
Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left, so probably don't have time to address another full question. I had a couple more in the chat, but if you guys want to take a look. But let's close it up with real quick. Ari, any parting messages to our teachers out there as they're considering tackling this when their students want to bring it to bear? Some of our teachers in our network aren't allowed to bring this conversation forward. It's really challenging. It's either been restricted, or as many tell us, it's just when they're concerned about bringing forward due to some of the potential outcomes that may happen. So just a quick message or thought.
Yeah. It's a very sad experience that we're in, where that so many of our institutions can't do this healthily and productively on their own. Like, we would have thought that the American ethos and the diversity of our country would have allowed us to be able to meet the challenges of this moment more effectively than we have. And I think it's okay to name that our social scaffolding was not strong enough, has not been strong enough for us to be able to carry this discussion in the ways that we would need to everywhere. And we can start to dissect what the contributing factors, whether it's the communications revolution of social media, growing diversity in the country, political polarization, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is diagnostic and important. But I think it's worth pausing and saying that it takes intention and it will take effort for us to be able to build, as I said, the necessary social scaffolding. And that might mean that our universities have to become places where dialogue and civil discourse becomes a necessary tool belt, where programs like Sphere that encourage viewpoint diversity become the norm, that a school's mission statement not may shift to recognize the need for dialogue, civil discourse. And then it doesn't only stay on the homepage, and it's not only the thing that the head of school says on a recruitment night, but it actually gets operationalized into programs so that an institution could say, we're really proud that if you graduate from fill in your school, you are entering the world with the ability to have this conversation. And it means being able to tolerate, as I saw someone in the chat say, a little more discomfort for viewpoints that you disagree with, and also be able to um, reduce one's footprint and maybe not use the most bombastic or confident terms that you would to express your opinion because you're making room for others. This is some of what I think it would be wonderful to see. And it's amazing to be here with so many educators committed to this work. And so I'll just end with that word of gratitude to all of you and to our organizers tonight. And of course, to my friend and teacher, Mustafa.
Mustafa, you're the teacher. Yeah, mutual. Thanks. John, I very briefly, thank you for really organizing this, and thanks to everyone who joined. It's very hard if a conversation on this topic becomes a statement of why the other side is so evil and why this problem will be solved when the enemy is crushed. And that's just not going to help anyone. But I think if the conversation is about building empathy, like this is how these people have suffered, this is how that people have suffered. They're actually going through similar anxieties about their future. Or, there are, like I always emphasize, like children, children were killed in October 7th. Then thousands of children killed were after that in Gaza. So their lives are precious, equally precious. So we cannot justify one or the death of this one or the other one, right? So, and the question is not even who to blame. The question is how to end this. Because if you ask who's to blame, everybody has a perfect answer. Of course, the other side is to blame for everything. I think the right question is how do we end this? And we end this by showing building common humanity, a sense of common humanity, not demonizing, not dehumanizing the other side, and trying to understand that they're coming from similar human emotions of fear and for the future, for their families. At 100 years of persecution or thousands of years of persecution that they've referred to. So I think reasonable conversations, fruitful conversations can be made if this is the spirit, not the spirit of who should be demonized and who should be seen as the enemy and we should suffocate or silence.
Mustafa, Ari, thank you so much for being here tonight. It's been an honor and a privilege to hear you both engage in this important dialogue. And we can't solve everything, but I think I'm seeing some of the comments of our teachers are really inspired and thinking about ways they can take this back to their classrooms. And that's what this is all about. So thank you very much for being here tonight. And everyone out there in the sphere, thank you for coming to this webinar. We've got another one coming up in February on our new rhetoric lesson plan. So tune in for that. But other than that, we'll say good night, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you for joining.